Our first speaker for this session is Mr. Charles Lowe. He's acting president, telemedicine, Royal Society of Medicine, London, and industry expert in telehealth. Thank you very much.
Just to correct that, by the way, I'm not acting president. I'm the previous president of the telemedicine section here, but not it makes any difference really. I've decided that I wear lots of different hats, and I've decided that the right hat to wear today is as managing director of something called the Digital Health and Care Alliance. Which we call DACA. I know that word does mean something else in Pakistan, but anyway, that's who we are, and I'm going to talk about medical apps. As many of you will be aware, the health app market is huge. And the predictions are that it's going to become huger. Although it's a relatively small part of the total apps market, there are still some 3 billion downloads per year. And if you look at the profitability of most of those apps, you'll see that 62% of them are actually downloaded less than 5,000 times, and that 48% of those apps create no net revenue for their creators, and a further 19% create very, very little. So there's an awful lot out there at present that is earning very little money, and so there's relatively little incentive for people to make their apps really high quality. So the challenge is on to actually find high quality apps, and indeed there are a few, but there are not many. And so deciding which app to use, and in your case often deciding which app to recommend to your patients is an extremely difficult thing to do. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the challenges of doing that, and then show you how, in fact, there are some organisations, and one of the organisations I'm working for, which is called our Mobile Health, is actually now doing a full app assessment that can give you assurance that what you're doing, that the apps that we tell you are good, you can recommend to your patients with confidence. One of the end results of not having good recommendations is shown here. DACA teamed up with Carers UK on a Department of Health project earlier this year, and it was to promote beneficial use of technology for carers in the UK, because what we found out was that only 5% of carers in the UK, that is people looking after other people as friends or relatives, were actually using technology. And what we found out was that over the past 4 years, from 2013 to 2017, awareness of the use of technology for caring has actually gone down. You know, most people now will use technology for things like banking, and even amongst carers, awareness of and use of banking is electronically is in the 80% region. But for actually helping people to find out whether their loved ones are all right and keeping an eye on them and things like that, it's extremely low. And the thing is that most of them don't know it exists, and if they do know it exists, they don't know what is good. So there's a complete confusion in that market that good assessment of technology would improve. So the first issue here is the issue of regulation, many people in the, certainly as apps developers, rail against regulation. But certainly in the medical world, I'm sure you'll agree, it's extremely important. And it's very important too to think through what an app can do. And a really good example of what might look out to be a benign app is something called a mole detector. Something that takes a photograph of or looks at a mole and then looks at it again in a week or so's time and tells you whether or not that mole is malignant. Now, for many people, they say, why should we be regulating that? Of course, the answer is, if you leave it too late and the mole detector is wrong, you can find yourself in a situation where it metastasizes, and you're in a much more of a problem than you would have been if it had been properly detected in the first place. Unfortunately, the EU regulation that we're still using was actually enacted in 1993, which is a long time before apps were ever even thought of. And then, of course, since then, there's lots of concern too, not only about medical regulation, but also data regulation, consumer legislation, and simple business-focused questions. So what we did in DACA was we put together a high-level medical app development process. And this is available on our website if anybody's interested. I'm certainly not going to go into the detail, and I'm not even going to cover the first line, which is just looking at business requirements. You'd be amazed how many app developers actually develop an app without thinking about who they're developing it for or why they're developing it. But the key components are, is it a medical device? Because if it's a medical device, it has to go through various rules and regulations, one of which is it has to comply with a set of quality and risk standards. Does it give good data privacy? Is there evidence to support the claims of efficacy? And finally, is there good post-market surveillance? Really, really important questions. And the medical regulation world is just about to be changed because of something called the Medical Devices Regulation, which is going to come in early 2020. It is already applying in the UK, and therefore it is thought that it will probably continue to apply after Brexit, although there has to be a certain amount of doubt over that. And the really important thing about that is it changes the definition of a medical device to include those two words, prediction and prognosis. So previously, if you had an app that might protect, I mean, there is, for example, an app that will predict the risk of somebody dying in the event of serious surgery. Now, my understanding is that currently that's not considered to be a medical device. But with the medical devices regulation, I would suggest it's likely that designation would change. And as someone who regularly reviews proposals for apps, it's surprising how many of those people are unaware of the fact that what they're proposing is actually a medical device and needs to be regulated as such and certified as such. The General Data Protection Regulation comes into force on the 25th of May 2018, and that has some very important points too, which also need to be borne in mind. Rushing on, I want to talk specifically, before I finish, about evidence. And specifically, the thing about digital health is that it enables new care pathways. So the technology itself rarely creates any benefit, but the care pathways that it enables deliver that benefit. So, for example, technology enables you to be treated at home rather than in a hospital, which can save a significant amount of money. But the technology itself doesn't save that money. It's the fact that you can now be treated at home that saves that money. And also those new care pathways, of course, require people to learn to do things differently. Now, professionals, obviously, and I'm sure you'd all agree, do expect evidence. However, the evidence for digital health has to be different to that which involves taking a medicine or taking a placebo, which is just a single intervention. Because for digital health, you can have 4 or even more interventions. And so there are different ways of evidencing the efficacy. And just to give you an example of why a randomized control trial really isn't always, sometimes it is, isn't always appropriate in this, is to consider when engineers build bridges, they bring together a whole lot of recognized engineering principles. They don't tend to do randomized control trials. And digital health, I would argue, is much more like now building a bridge than doing a trial on medication, where the medication itself is going to have unexpected genetic effects or variable genetic effects, and where people may or may not decide they're going to take the drug, because neither of those effects impact on digital health. So to conclude, there is help at hand. There's an organisation called Our Mobile Health, which I'd be very happy to tell you more about if you want to catch me afterwards. And what we do is we look at all those dimensions I showed there. The effectiveness of an app, the usability, the accessibility, the stability, the safety specifically, whether it needs regulatory approval and whether it's got it, its privacy, its interoperability, its security, and whether there is a future development plan. So, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Charles, for a very interesting presentation. So we'll have time for a couple of questions. Suhail.
Charles, this is a very revealing presentation. You've been spending last 30 years of your life in telemedicine. Who else knows more than you? In this country, your name is quite big in telemedicine. I just want to address what you mentioned about no random controlled trials in telemedicine.
Yeah.
I think this is probably the true matter in for the last 20 years. I've been handling medical IT, and I have felt we don't need the trials to a certain extent because the technology is evolving so fast.
Yes.
They can't catch the pace with the technology. The apps are coming. There's no truth, singular truth in technology. So I agree with the statement, and I just want to add something to it, that the clinical adaptation of an app, that is a totally different ballgame as compared to developing an app. Because that needs a doctor to use that technology.
Yeah.
So we need to create some awareness within doctors that they should be part of the process of making an app. I'm trying to get at this point. A doctor should be involved in the process of creating an app at some stage, so the clinical adaptation becomes easier because they also understand the patient perspective, not just the clinician perspective.
Yeah.
Whereas the technologist, sorry to say, doesn't have a clue. Thank you.
I would completely agree with you there. There's one slight reservation I've got though, and that is that before you saw your first iPhone, did you know you needed an iPhone? And there is something called disruptive innovation, and once in a while someone has to come up with something completely different. And certainly the rumours go that when Apple developed their iPhone, they didn't consult with anybody. They just built it and decided that people would like it, and they got it right. But you're absolutely right. One of the interesting things about digital health is that it has two different sets of users. And what I've noticed anyway is that unless you satisfy both those sets of users, it doesn't work. You've got professional users who are the clinicians you're referring to. And certainly if a clinician doesn't think something is a good idea, it's very unlikely that it's ever going to work. But also the patient has to like it, because in my early days delivering telehealth in Newham, we convinced the doctors it was a great idea, but we had these huge big boxes that actually heated up the room so much in the tower blocks in Newham that in the summertime they switched them off at night time because the whole room was overheating, and so patients just really didn't like them at all. So they caused all sorts of grief in that way. So you've got to satisfy both clinicians and doctors, and that can be quite challenging sometimes. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask about Apple. You were talking about Apple. Things like the Apple Watch, the Fitbit, which monitor your heart rate and these other things, will they have to be seen as medical devices then? Are they a medical device?
They're not medical. Those are not medical devices, no. Apple has been very careful to make sure that their watch is not registered as a medical device yet, although they're talking about doing that at some stage into the future. They're very careful to say that they're merely indicators of your level of fitness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for a very insightful talk. You talked about the Medical Regulations Act, which may come in force, I guess, in 2020. Is there any kind of process in order to become certified, or for your app to be certified, that can start now? Or?
Yes, there is a process already. The existing legislation is something called the Medical Devices Directive. It's going to be turned into a regulation. If you're a European Union legal buff, you will understand that a directive is something that is applied by an individual country, whereas a regulation is applied uniformly across all currently 28 countries. The Medical Devices Directive is quite similar, but the regulation essentially introduces the concept of an app. And so it specifically regulates it rather more strictly than the previous one did, because it didn't actually, it mentioned software, but it didn't recognise the concept of an app. If you want to catch me afterwards, I will cheerfully take you through the process involved for doing it. But just as a rough rule of thumb, if you are going to get something recognised as a medical device, you should expect to spend about £50,000, expect to spend about 6 months on it, and be required to accept some very onerous quality manufacturing standards for both the development and the production of that software. Thank you.